Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, the king sat upon a golden throne in a shining palace. A beautiful image, but a king sitting on a golden throne within a shining palace, not really a man of the people, right? The king had a bit of a problem, as he didn't really connect with his subjects. He didn't understand what was happening in his kingdom. He was so busy dealing with diplomats and king stuff that, the plight of the common man wasn't something that he knew much about. So he called the prince to him and he said, "What can we do about this?" And the prince said, "Well, I have an idea. What if I were to we'll spread a rumor saying that I'm going away to a foreign country to do something diplomatic, and then I can swap clothes with the stable boy and go out and be amongst the people unrecognized." King thought this a pretty good idea, and so after a little bit of planning, they had the heralds announce that the prince would be leaving the kingdom for just a little bit. We weren't sure exactly how long he would be gone, but he was traveling off to a foreign country to negotiate some kind of trade agreement or something. And the prince went down and talked to the stable boy and said, "Well, how do you get bread? Where do you live when you're not working here? How do you take care of yourself?" And the stable boy just said, "Well, I do the best I can with whatever I've got." And they swapped clothes, and the prince laid aside his finery and took on the pretty much rags of the stable hand, covered himself with the filth of the stable, and left the castle, and no one was any the wiser. They thought it was just the stable boy going about his errands. He went out into the city and looked around, and he saw all the traders and all the people gathered in the city square, and he was starting to get a little hungry, so he went over to the bread merchant and looked at all of that, and then his stomach let out a great growl. The bread merchant turned to him and said, "Are you hungry?" "Oh, yes, sir, very hungry." And the merchant said, "Have you coin?" "What? No, sir." "Well, then I can't help you. Move along. You're bad for business." Well, he went over to the man selling silks and fine attire. And as the silk merchant looked at this boy in filthy rags, he wouldn't even talk to him. He knew this man could never afford his great fineries. You see some of those things where it's like, if you have to ask the price, it's too much. Well, the prince found that as well. In fact, he was even accused of stealing when someone finally gave him a wormy old apple to eat. Put in prison overnight. The next day he said, "That's it. I'm out of here. I got to leave this city." And so he wandered out into the countryside, and after a long journey, he was very tired, very dusty. He sat down next to a well and didn't even have the strength to crank the bucket up. But soon a young maiden came by, and she was drawing water for her household and asked the young man if he could use a drink. Taking a ladle of the water, she brought it over to him and said, "It looks like you can use this." The young man asked her name, and she said, "Well, everyone just calls me Kless. My real name is Ecclesia, but everyone just calls me Kless or Klesia. Do you have anywhere to stay tonight?" she asked. "Why, no, I was thinking of finding a nice, comfortable tree to curl up underneath, and sleep under the stars sounds nice and romantic and all that." She said, "It's going to be very cold tonight. Why don't you come with me, and I'm sure there's a spot for you in my father's house." So she took him in, made sure that he was warm and well fed, never asked his name, didn't seem to care about where he came from or who he was. And that next morning, after the most refreshing night's sleep he had had in quite some time, the father approached him and said, "My name is Karis, and do you have work to do?" It's like, "No, I'm kind of between jobs at the moment, so to speak." And he said, "Well, I have sheep that need tending. Do you think you could go and look after my sheep?" I can do that. I think I've never watched sheep before, but they're sheep. How hard can it be?" He was in for a rude awakening. But he went out with the other shepherds, who laughed at him, mocked him, but Kless went with him and made sure that the other shepherds accepted him and took him as one of their own and helped him to learn. And for 3 years he stayed in that household, watching the sheep. And the sheep multiplied greater than Karis could ever have imagined. And even when one of the sheep wandered off, as sheep tend to do, the other shepherds would mind those who had not gone off, but our prince in disguise would always leave the other 99 feeding on the hillside and go look for the one that was lost, and would bring it back on his shoulders rejoicing. Well, after a few years, word came from the castle. The king was, getting old. Even kings are subject to old age. And the king said, "I think it's time for me to step down, to abdicate and hand the kingdom over to the prince. So we're going to recall him from the country he's been in for the last 3 years." The king sent out the call and said, "The prince is returning. Come, join in the celebration as he comes back." And he invited the entire kingdom to welcome the prince home. Well, our prince wasn't all that far away. He was just outside the city watching sheep. And he said, "I think I'm going to go and see this coronation and watch the prince come back. I've never seen a prince before." I guess he never looked in a mirror, but... So the father said, "If you go, will you take my 3 daughters? Because I want them to see the prince too." He had 3 girls much younger than Kless: Faith, Hope, and Love. And these 3 the young man brought with him. Karis had given him a new set of clothes, a wonderful bath. He looked befitting of a prince, but after 3 years in the rugged wilderness, his hair was a mess, his hands calloused and worn with work, and he probably didn't smell the greatest either, but he came back into the city and no one recognized him. The day of the coronation came, and through secret ways he went back into the castle. Every castle has its secret doors and things like that. And he was perfectly groomed. He was given the royal attire. Everything was perfect. And as he stepped out onto the castle ramparts and was proclaimed the new king, everyone cheered. But then he said, "My first pronouncement as king is to reward those who have been so kind to me for the last 3 years." Everyone was puzzled. "What, do you mean this foreign country that you were off in? What's going on here?" He said, "For the last 3 years, I've been living amongst you. I've been going in and out of this city, been asking for bread, clothing, water, shelter. Who took care of me when I was sick? Who took care of me and visited me when I was imprisoned? Who gave me to eat? Who gave me to drink?" And as they looked on this shining figure on the castle walls, they said, "We've never seen you in our city. If we had and known it was you, we certainly would have given you anything you asked for." He said, "If you don't do it to me when you don't know me, why should I believe you're going to do it now?" And so he took all those who had mistreated him, who had reviled him, who had put him in prison, and banished them from the city. And he took Cles, Ecclesia, as his bride, welcoming her into the castle. And, well, I would say they lived happily ever after. That only happens in fairy tales. But they had a pretty good marriage and many children. The shepherd had become the king, foretold by Ezekiel, told again in Matthew. Does your prince walk among you in disguise today? Do you see his face in the least of these brothers of mine that you pass on the street? When he comes again in glory, are you on the king's right or on the king's left? Which is it going to be? As God's people, we are ecclesia, the church, the bride of Christ, our King. So let us then go and do as he has done. Let us now rise for a time of prayer.